Good evening. I was kind of tempted to just let Chris catch up with everybody, but I think we should have a poetry reading. I'm Jeffrey O'Brien. Welcome to the last of the spring Holloway readings. We're really happy to have former colleague and present poet Chris Nealon here, reading with our own Jess Lazar. Before we get to the reading, I just want to tell you a couple of things about next fall, actually. Cecil Giscombe curates the fall semesters, and he already knows who's coming. And those people are Ray Armantrout, Sawako Nakayasu, Erica Hunt, who will also give a mixed blood talk, and Don Bogan. And the Holloway Poet-in-Residence next year will be Farid Matuk, and he will be here in the spring of 2020 as opposed to the fall semester. Katsupizio is here to introduce Jess Lazar, and then Mary Wilson will introduce Chris Nealon. Thank you for being here. Let's begin.
In his only public lecture, Wittgenstein turns his attention to the problem of expressing certain aesthetic truths in language. He explains, "A teacup will only hold a teacup full of water, even if I were to pour out a gallon of it." I would suggest that Jessica Lazar's poetry also begins with this assumption, but finds joyful return in the possibilities of language's stutters. Like the eponymous figure of her book, Sergei Kuzmich from All Sides, who roves through the work as an indeterminate shifting signifier, the act of thinking in her poems is continually out of rhythm with itself, finding itself insufficient for its own purposes, discovering, as she writes, there is no is in is. Like Wittgenstein, but also like William Blake's Piper, who stains the water clear with his reed, in Jessica's poetry, the tension between signification and experience is rewarded over and against any such hollow comforts of immediacy. In her work, we find, I quote, "Echo so entry it is primary sound." Let me linger on one moment. "There are so many ways to think of us that I have thought them all," reads her poem, Commas in Dante. As you'll note, the second line, "that I have thought them all," defers the logical expectation of the first, correcting the notion that a romantic relationship could ever offer unlimited imaginative potential. Within this chastened epistemology, the lines, which let me say once more, "there are so many ways to think of us, that I have thought them all," waver between the affective registers of optimism and exhaustion. This is just one of the many instances in which Jessica's poetry performs sly turns of meaning, leveraging a technical grace to render shifts in feeling that would otherwise be imperceptible. This restlessness of thought is what generates the dense knit of puzzles and delights and pangs that characterizes her poetry, which unravels its references in every turn. Orientations of address are reversed, repetition disfigured by new contexts. Jessica's poem, Sensual Delight and Virtue, opens exuberantly with "Chow, chow, chow, bella, bella, bella." Mediation thickens. The thing we look through is called into focus, but never as ironic gesture. Instead, the sustained attention to what we might call the grammatical structures of desire, intimacy, and loss intensifies their strains. I would also place Jessica as the beneficiary of a lyric tradition, one that is specifically romantic. Not just because a poem I very much hope she reads, The Rock, reanimates Keats's The Living Hand in surprising ways, but because her remarkable performance style, which you will soon see, so too reanimates an earlier mode of poetic recitation. Please welcome Jessica Lazar.
Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. Thank you, Chris. It's really a pleasure to read with you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Alex and Jeffrey. This is an excerpt that is the kind of end portion of a long cento that's in the back of the book that's over there, where all the references are. Whatever his defects, a poet at least thinks a poem more important than anything which can be said about it. But how shall men meditate in that which they cannot understand? I will ask them a question about life. If they understand me, I will be saved. If they do not feel and understand me, I will be a poor, miserable man, and I will suffer. In his soul, there suddenly arose such an unexpected tangle of youthful thoughts and hopes, contradictory to his whole life, that, feeling himself unable to comprehend his own state, he fell asleep at once. What matters it to me if someone does not understand this? Let him too rejoice and say, "What is this?" Let him rejoice even at this, and let him love to find you while not finding it out, rather than, while finding it out, not to find you. He opened the window. The night was fresh and stilly bright. He opened a second window. Whether it was respect, envy, or expectation, he did not know. No, life isn't over at the age of 31. It's not enough that I know all that's in me. Everyone else must know it too. Everyone must know me so that my life is not only for myself, but so that it is reflected in everyone and they all live it together with me. There were many chosen that were greater in other men's eyes than their own, and that sought the truth rather than their own praise. Again they came, or were thought to come, to the work. The work hath not been huddled up. A man feareth not the blame of convenient slackness. Hey, why are you always walking ahead of me? Well, why are you always walking behind me? Suffering does not follow us. It goes before us. And when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. He wanted so much to find in someone else the living ideal of that perfection for which he strove. Better to be happy than wise. Success is to be happy with the wise. I wish to explain what God is to everyone, but I will not if people start laughing. Then Sarah denied, saying, I laughed not, for she was afraid. And he said, Nay, but thou didst laugh. Everything will be forgiven her, for she loved much, and everything will be forgiven him, for he had much fun. Perhaps they wouldn't have forgiven her anyway, but it would have been for something different. And the botanist who finds that the apple falls because the cellular tissue degenerates and so on will be as right and as wrong as the child who stands underneath and says that the apple fell because he wanted to eat it and prayed for it. He may gape long ere a bird fall into his mouth. We live among. Too much explain. He hath one eye in his neck. A troop cometh. This dreamer cometh. This heap is a witness between me and thee this day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. I will not let thee go except thou bless me. The sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother, keep that thou hast unto thyself. For 100 pieces of money. Do not interpretations belong to God? There was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50, and when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? I answer you according to your asking. A man hath no more than he hath good of. The quality of nothing hath not such need to hide itself, for nothing is secret that shall not be made manifest, neither anything hid that shall not be known. Take heed, therefore, how you hear. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken, even that which he seemeth to have. Here's your money. I didn't even count it. For what is a man advantaged if he gain the whole world and lose himself? I should have said that the cento is called loss. Now I'm going to read 4 poems. The Rock. I wrote these. The Rock. I tried to chase the phantom. I stood in it. I recognized a deficit, the problem located in me or others, but in that the phantom could not be addressed. I reached out and it addressed itself to me. Life is a process. A pretty glow from a lamp, a cloud glowers over and troubles the phantom within that assumption. So me, I couldn't say what I received. I was relieved. That was the phantom, and I, the recipient, could not be addressed, but to it. This next poem is called Thinking, Differentiating, Crashing. It has 5 sections, 4 of which have titles. Definitions. The feather, the part of the bird that does not decay. The soul, the part of the human that does not decay. Knowing the soul, we can know of the feather, we can know only the soul. Fish. Fish in a bowl, aging without effort, like to watch a long time obscured by people who wave. The rest are displaced onto the water, into the heart of the viewer or elsewhere for later. If we strip them away, it looks like a woman. No wonder it took 2 tries to make her. Addition. 1 has a wonder, 2 imagine death, and they stone a body I looked like once I thought, oh, I thought, in order to think. In order to think, one must learn how. I could let you teach me how, if I could let you. Love. In love with complication, wounded by urgency, surmounting memory like a cresting ship. Elements compete for spatial representation. If you don't hear me, elements compete for spatial representation. The dead compete within a definition of consciousness that doesn't include them and the stone over and what I looked like when I invented her. I said, oh, she's not what I thought. There was faith instead of God and food instead of sleep. The only good was forgiveness of evil, Portia. The rain lasted only an hour, the field only an acre, but I never could tell a field from rain. This is called Libido. Not a Hopper painting, but a photo of our street in his day. Horse shit covering the unpaved way, and the pharmacy in essentially the same place as today. My dull branch, too wet to flame, is that olfactory sense gone missing. Our nose bleeds from the grief. If any laughing soul became a circle and swore to loop a dance all night and roll it out like money carpets, a person exiting would think to walk libido, the dog of wonders. How quickly focus comes to view, the thing I'm looking at you through, the thing I look away into. You, the telescope, take from my gaze, but a kaleidoscope takes its place. I summer in its triple vision, my calendar, clothes, a clock on the wall. I love to remember myself in that season, bathing rarely, pining with each new hand, my father calling about his will. The conversation that ensued became my inheritance, the way we discuss wills, not what we put in them. Still, my stares differentiated then. Suitors climbed until their souls went up, like pools committed to aerial memory, a collection of laps timed to nations that form and disperse, contraries they interview me toward. Now, avoiding all obvious rising suns, fist in my mouth, I am the West. You know, something I've never shared about that last poem is that I wrote the first draft of it while I was having a nosebleed. Like, I just was having a nosebleed, and I was like, what am I gonna do to wait this out, you know? And I was like, maybe I'll try to write a poem. So I'll end with this final poem that's called Admiration. We fought so hard, Teddy told me, to pull over on the highway so he could get out. Why pop musicians use children's voices in their songs was what we were fighting about. I asked him why he thought they did. Huh, he said. I never thought about that. You never thought about that? I asked, really asking, why haven't you ever thought about anything? And really saying, you've been all your life so talented and beautiful, you've never had to think. He almost moved to Iowa with me. Instead, from our collective existence, blessed by natural gifts, erupted miseries we are still kept apart and from our better labors by. Teddy's disregard for health and even sometimes life itself inspires me. He could do anything, but likes to fail. So though his presence creates expectation, no one expects of him more than he's willing to give. He saves the time he doesn't spend for the musician he will be or is, as I suspect we have by now become what we always thought we were working toward. Teddy made me feel I could do anything. He told me if I'd picked up the cello young enough, I'd have been better than him. That's a picture of our love then, mine usurped by Teddy's obsession, the healthy part of which, his admiration, changed me irreversibly. Now Teddy admires no one, which is the first step toward real humility. Of course, I think I'm better than you, he said too, but not of me. He said it as part of a story. We had been walking with sweating iced teas, but stopped to sit on the small side steps of the Ukrainian Catholic Church with gold mosaics. He described his latest breakup and breaking into his ex's house to steal back the mandolin she stole from him. With me, he never even got out of the car. Teddy had a white van that smelled like serenity, an essential oil blend someone gave me, and that before the ride home he applied to my wrists and neck. I just think that if anything happens between us again, it should be with intention, I said. Teddy laughed. I understand, he said, why you would say that. We pulled up outside the meter building on Wood Street, where once, when I was asleep and didn't hear the landline ring, he left a note on my car that read, I'm on our side. We go on faith that others know the silent contracts we keep with them. It was of Teddy my misconception that to the unspoken he lacked the subtlety to agree. It was my own lack of subtlety I couldn't see. Leaving the van, I turned to make sure I hadn't left anything in my seat. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Can you hear me? Solid Gold, the first poem of Christopher Nealon's Heteronomy, introduces itself. Let's start with 1978, he writes. Whenever I call you friend, maybe. Truly lovely, though hollowed out by 1995, that skin-crawling scene in Safe where Julianne Moore is trying to convince herself she's having a good time at the Toxicity Reduction Campground's Wednesday dance. If you don't get the reference here, you might run a Google search on whenever I call you friend, and pretty soon you'll find yourself on YouTube listening to that duet by Stevie Nicks and Kenny Loggins, which, as Nealon says, is truly lovely. A love song to the idea of friendship, a friend song to the quotidian or nightly revolution that is love. And if you keep listening while reading, other voices enter the mix. Heidegger and René Char, Rousseau and Robin. The songs are so crowded, writes Nealon, and this one is no exception. With heteronomy, Nealon names the condition we are all in. It's the condition of being subject to forces outside the self, forces against which selfhood can only be a flimsy barrier. But Nealon's poetry doesn't want to stage a retreat. Poets come up against the police, capital, and other poets. The protest gives way to the dance floor and vice versa, and the whole time there's a lot of jostling. Quote, "The argument seems to be every battle has two sides, and so does poetry. The real and the ideal, two kinds of opposition bleed into one another." This means that Adrienne Rich and Wallace Stevens share an uncomfortable line, even though, as Nealon admits, they probably wouldn't have liked each other. But it doesn't mean that this proximity of opposites will give way to a platitudinous truce, a happy heterogeneity where the mere fact of variety is transformative. Or, and here I stumble, maybe it does, but if so, then the difference Nealon celebrates makes what is other or hetero into something decidedly queer. In reference to Stevens and Rich, Nealon admits, no alchemy can make these two positions speak. But then in the next breath, he suggests that alchemy, which, like poetry, is basically kidding yourself, might produce solid gold. Christopher Nealon teaches American literature and aesthetic theory at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of The Matter of Capital, Poetry and Crisis in the American Century, and Foundlings, Lesbian and Gay Historical Emotion Before Stonewall. He's also written 4 books of poems, The Joyous Age in 2004, Plummet in 2009, Heteronomy in 2014. And his latest book of poems, The Shore, is forthcoming from Wave Books in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Chris Nealon.
Thank you, Mary. That was truly lovely. And thank you, Jeffrey and Alex. Thank you all for coming. It is amazing and unsettling to see so many people I've known for so long, and it is a beautiful thing to be in this room again. I'm going to read 1 really short poem and 3 longer poems. And I tried to choose some things that have some of your names in them. But I'll start out with this shorter poem called Troubled, and it's a little bit of interest to me just now because I realize that it has changed genre since I wrote it 10 years ago. Troubled. I am not gay. I am from the future. I have bent reality to my will. I have solved your problems of organization and wandering. Born in the suburbs, you craved novelty. Military paranoia sent you off to school. Now, though, leveraged past relief and enslaved to what's extruded every morning, you are repelled by the burgeoning possibilities. You take up bird watching desperately. But I bring you new containers for reflection and for commentary. I restore to you opacity of signs. Ha ha, General Squire. The Muzak has formed real songs. No longer will you fool me with your tricks, John Ashbery. This poem is called The Dial. The purpose of society is mutual aid. There. Is that so hard? In the general prologue, in the rhythm of the saints, I'm only the narrator. I can't be everywhere at once. The things you never say to your friends, because we only speak through gesture, putty. But the glory motivating it to move, well, never to forget your friends. Yes, and hunchback like a scholar on the trains of Baltimore, I find myself triumphantly scrawling Veblen in the margins, all in caps at the top of the page, wanting you to share it with, and your poem about the restoration of the world, fluorescent yellow vests that crumple into hours of the day, and Joshua, choppy water, bouncing me toward Marco Polo, how I think of you, installed in the customs house and barring the way. Somewhere off to my right, the grave of Ezra Pound. Waves against the hull like knuckles on a door, a world built out of echoes that gradually assume substantiality. I tell you, after a week in Italy, you really, really want to see a painting of the Buddha. Oh, Juliana, if you read this, I tried to be a peasant, looking at a picture of an angel, but I couldn't believe in love until I got to the creation of the animals. How they launch into life from out of the void, blind, all of history ahead of them. And that's when I thought of you. Like, do those robins ever settle in at night and just think, best nest ever? That's the subject of this poem. I had a dream. It went like this. Time was discovering itself. My flight was delayed. Urgently, I needed to join you, but there was nothing to do but wait. I fiddled with Grinder a bit. I wrote a little poem. Arizona, bright light. Country I avoided, megachurches, chain hotels, and Concourse B. The furtive, the religiously punished, male gazes, disappointed, anguished, arrogant. The arrogance of men who've really only managed to be born into the hegemon. And the kind-hearted faces, the ones that make you wonder what protects them. One of them is 50 feet away. Another one's 3 miles from here. Another one is leaping free right now in fury with a spiral kick. Somewhere outside America is a different poetry, lusher, maybe, or grounded in a velvet-fisted sense of words and bodies tugged at astrally, but not for me. I turned that software on in Phoenix and turned it off in Washington. I've been thinking about the charming pomposity of French Maoists, so I called it pur et dur. I've been feeling bad about the way my fear of anger had so poorly equipped me for any kind of revolution. The way I always want to skip the jump jet and get right to the Luther Vandross. I've been thinking about how my anger was perpetual and how only my friends could help me find the context for it. And I saw that in another kind of poem, right now would be the moment for a turn to the objective. Doves flushed out from under grasses. Instead, I twisted the dial. Trapped in another airport, along a winding concourse, there was hideous public sculpture and an afterthought of seasonal prints depicting young boys holding gourds. Overhead, from several monitors at once, I heard the echoing voice of a perky blonde Cerberus advising us to barricade our rooms. The fighter jet was landing on a dollar bill. Outside, clouds, serene. Gaddafi had just been killed. The voice was taking credit. My headphones couldn't drown it out. It was addressing me. And what it was saying was, you will never be ready, never be ready to join your friend. I understood that everyone around me was waiting for flights that never departed, that in fact the business travelers reading the paper and the families in Qdoba were the dead, like my father, recently dead. I couldn't turn the dial. I reached for my notebook, I hunched over and wrote. In a complicated cross breeze, kept from where the tides go, 2 times you appeared to me. Once as a woodcutter with an axe about your neck. Later, unencumbered as a boy. Marin in halogen, a black security cloak around the graphics ranch. And in a passage commonly referred to as the physical interlude, I saw your body in Ireland. I saw your body at the dawn of time, punished for picking that lemon, or in some other limbo, late America. Come to me. You've already come. You with your tremors and your three-toed cane. You with your unmerciful athletic beauty. Oh, in the peaks, the Trinity Alps. Oh, in the grave with thee, happily to lie. I put down my pen and I knew the title of the poem would have to be taken from Thomas Nash, that I should call it Sparrow Blasted. After, what did he say? Being blighted with a mysterious power of whose existence one is skeptical. Power like sorrow. But what a rake that Nash was. The cops went after him in 1590 just for calling his girlfriend Frankie in a poem. I read it softly out loud a few times to test the cadences, mixed them in with what was on my headphones, started singing. Gradually I realized the other travelers were staring at me. My blood ran cold. The voice on the monitor had turned its gaze upon me too. I laid my pen in the fold of my notebook. Slowly, I removed my headphones. Never felt such shame. The voice said, "You can go now." Before I tell you what I found, let me mention what my friends were up against. First, other poets. The ones who've always said it's arrogant to have a politics. The ones who worry that we're going to spoil the last untainted thing. Then the police, bearing down on them on campus, later massed against them in the squares. Finally, Capitol, unconcerned with poetry, at least as long as poetry never became a metaphor for fighting back. For years, this meant my poems would settle on a mixture of defiance and wistfulness. Even on the plane or in the tunnel or however it was, I finally got to the Plaza del Sol. I could only write like that. I wrote, alone behind a blind, I watch the very rich emerge at night. Left-wing homos trapped between the manifesto and the novel of manners. There's like 6 of us. Illusory power, colored vapor to dissolve the material world. Cheap-ass zooms, crossfades, how they carol to you all adventure season, calling, come to Bali. But you only get as far as the edge of the west. Stock boys clearing out the inventory, marshweed swaying, the wires in your jacket starting to show. Then you end up a minute or two ahead of the language. I mean, it took English like 200 years to come up with, I know, right? And how long will that last? As long as the summer of Stieg Larsson. Hours. Seasons. Poetry. Doing its thing. That one had no title. What would you call it? How we went down to defeat in our poems. Later, how we didn't. Or in cafes, you'd listen to the outlines of a conversation and think, first date? Job interview? Then you'd realize, actually, they're working out a theory of value. A horrible one. So this one guy says to his frat mother, if this place goes to hell, I am out of here. Meaning Earth. And I'm supposed to be like, oh, he's not so bad, he's just a fiscal conservative. There's a dial I can twist in 2 directions labeled more like Ovid, more like Boethius. I tried out conceptual art. I I tried a sorry, bumbling meta for Glenn Beck. I kept going back to the troubadours. Later in the same cafe, this other guy was like, dude, I'm so glad I'm not in Egypt right now. Can that really be months ago? I turned into a serpent, reborn as a tree. Speak to me, philosophy. It's funny weather, warm for Brumaire. That one I called the kind, the blue, because only Couperin was enough that day to keep at bay the sense I was alone. But that was an eternity ago. Let me tell you what I found. A breeze, a cough. And I was in a landscape like a landscape painting. We all were. And we could move around. Someone turned the dial and time passed back and forth through seasons, winter, summer, summer, winter, spring, fall, winter, fall. It settled on fall. Like little tercids, everybody staggered into place. There were groves, a forest, cities on a plain. The corner of the plaza had been labeled the year in ideas. Lisa scrawled, continuous language is the commons. Someone else had left a note that said, don't tase me, bro. And indeed, police were circling the area. But on every branch of every tree were candy wrappers, fortune cookies. Collis's read, Vancouver's got your back. Another was a poem from Nealon, Il giorni sono scuri, ma noi abbiamo il fuoco. And this is not to mention the passenger pigeons, but after the fashion of the courteous medieval poets, I will spare you. Here I omit 3,000 others who attended the bout. I'll pass over Andrew Kenauer saying, raise your hand if this is the most alive you've ever felt. I'll skip the part where little Sasha is holding up a sign for plutocrats that reads, you are me, and I will have to cut you in half. And finally, I'll leave it to you to puzzle over the masked figures in the alleys leading to the plaza. They'd been stenciling the dialectic, all in caps, but ran off halfway through the word. Reader, you know the story of the bloody battles that unfolded after. You know it better than I do. They haven't happened yet. You know the stories of internal struggle, botched analysis, and tactical defeat. You'll have seen the faces of the women thinking, really? I still have to remind you not to grope me in the commune? You'll have noticed that the names are generally the names of white people. But none of this will make me wish I were with you any less. As I fade into time, as I enter my era, I've accepted that my mind works best when imitating vantages of paradise. With you in the square that day, I saw the thimble where the mind is. Like the briefest waterfall behind my eyes, I saw the ocean where the thimble was. And on the final page of the bright red book that dropped into the plaza, I read the words, true freedom will always lie in the ability to make friends. I felt the scratch of wool. My dream was ending. Lisa, Jeffrey, dialing time around an axis. Thank you. Names of months, the names of years. I felt the warmth of Rob beside me. And reaching down into the world as it took shape again, I felt, what were they? Right, the dollars in my pocket. Is everybody okay? Okay, I'm gonna read two more poems. This is called The Victorious Ones. It's in a bunch of little sections, there's 17 of them. I think deep inside it, in the middle somewhere, it shares a rhyme with Jessica's poem, Libido. Then came fire. We drove out past the flooding to watch the birds. Long-lashed boys in hoodies looked up from the sidewalk to absorb the sky. Ancient women left the bedsides of their long-ago boys. And in the great transition, no one could tell if we were doomed or free. Is there an original exile? I think the Germans think we were driven from the forest. Sometimes, like a distant station playing a tune, you half remember, I can hear it, driven out into the terrifying open to savannah. That's not my myth. Or I don't want it to be. I do like imagining high-value objects become nearly worthless. People just leaving their prized possessions lying around. It gives me a break from that squirrely huddling near the outlets feeling. That, well, if a catastrophe hits, at least my phone will be charged. Yeah. So maybe just leave it on the toilet for the next guy. Maybe just delete all your contacts. Go. My friends encourage me, take care of me. You should totally become an anarchist. Just stay off the listserv. I was deep in the kaleidoscope, feeling it allowing me to sense all time, but I couldn't tell anyone about it. I think because I was dead. The daylit surface, teeming with youth. It makes me feel like mine has been not lost so much as just subducted. Abruptly, it's the final day of spring. Your pointillist relationship to calendar time. Tap that date, tap it. Touchscreen indifferent to your bandaged thumb. And yes, like every other poet with a child, I have dreamed of mine along some empty road in camouflage and tatters, scrambling for potable water in 2046. But you know what? Fuck the zombie apocalypse. I'm gonna imagine him comrades. Oh man. Praying to the wrong gods again. Please, Flux, keep me open. Just another poem. Whoops, no, see you later. 13 weeks, winter salt, across the Al Jazeera banner. April lawns and trees, Chaucerian and raggedy with hungry geese and mockingbirds. We were sold kenosis as a way to overcome discrepancies in scale, but everything hinged on the tone we did it in. There's a river running backward through this poem to the sources of literature. You'd think that would be a good thing. But I take seriously that beauty is the beginnings of terror in a quarreling way. I do think beauty halfway staves off terror with forms or dance or symbols. I know we're never far from terror. But here's the thing. Even saying that sounds right-wing. And that's because the right has always practiced terror to insist that we can never get away from it. I say this as a homosexual. Terror. That's the meaning of male homophobia. It's not a fear of butt-fucking, please. It's the punishment of male insouciance, male lightness, a bodily comportment and a vocal inflection that gets heard as everything is beautiful, everything is fine. Those hammer blows administered to gay boys' skulls. They say, no, we are not free from violence. This is not Arcadia. How dare you flounce around? So when my colleagues critique the romantic symbol, critique the romantics for peddling false consolation, when the modernists champion objectivity and unsymbolizable allegory because we know better than to trust in pretty symbols but keep forgetting because we need art to remind us that life is hard. I wonder, who are we talking to? I mean, 3 cheers for allegory. But there's a gossamer, a Holloway of symbols, isn't there? There's a way a beaten body looks in silk. I didn't become a professor so I could demystify my students. I didn't kiss that kid in 1987 because I'd forgotten terror. Maybe Rilke, writing on the dime of the House of Thorn and Taxis, knew this. Maybe he didn't just mean, whoa, those angels are intense. Either way, when I say beauty, I don't mean razzle-dazzle, and I don't mean the crucifixion. When I say terror, I don't mean the Titans. There's a river running backward through this poem to the sources of our struggle with each other. Guilty as charged. I do have something to peddle, but you know I can't help it. I came of age in that great mixtape swap meet of the 1980s. Hey, you want to feel like this? Hey, I have a crush on you. Later, watching waters part around my friend as he took over the club. Since gone on to glory. As though the early 90s were an apical moment in the history of longing. As though those vocals, Rob Ness, had hit a plaintive note that was never to be repeated. When in fact it was just another episode of black women teaching white boys how to ache for free. Later, still, a Saturn turned. Me and Steven on the Scheffergasse, chatting up the bar back on a strangely silent Friday night. Hey, where are the gay people in Frankfurt anyway? Oh, they are in the forest. So yeah, the mythic method. This place, Hammertown, I'm talking about, this imaginary place, actually has a very specific history, a history of genocide. And that's something that the poetry I was proposing had absolutely no way of dealing with. There's a lot of reasons I stopped writing, but that's one of them. It's just an aspect of reality that I was never going to be able to deal with. Peter Cully, I thought you should know. The day after you died, I took Parkway with me into the woods. Or it was Rock Creek Park. I fell asleep contentedly beneath a tree around the halfway point. I wasn't dreaming quite. My sleep was not that deep. But in the quiet, I could hear you approach. I heard you telling me you'd liked reading backwards as a child. I felt you were describing, in case I wanted to try it, how you'd learned to write those lines like brushed up nap on a trampled carpet, fresh again. You know I'll never have your mad skills, but I'm taking you with me into the woods. Peter, I bet you knew this let-down post-revolutionary feeling, this lower limit private perception feeling, this too solid flesh hell is other people, Arcturian hell is my body feeling. Most days, these days, I've got nothing but my tepid intellectual watchfulness. But sometimes, in distraction, I get tugged at from behind, get tugged from this Cheetah Kasha backdoor in the mind. Usually I ignore it, but every now and then I turn the handle and it's like, bam! A Narnia of forms. Insubstantial forms. Peter, this is better. It's as though the ache in me to find substantiality subsides, the ache to find it in boys' bodies, to find in it the firmest earth on which to take a stand. That firm ground would never be enough against the weapons they have stashed in readiness against us. Those hammer blows. Those anonymous "who do you think you are" letters from the FBI encouraging revolutionaries to consider suicide. But we're unjustified. It's like the sword thrust into us would just find nothing. like we know our poetry is as nothing to the waves of sound. So yeah, I watched a lot of space epics as a kid. Look at me, all Obi-Wan. But fantasies aren't just implanted in us. They tap into something, right? Trembling, inexistent. Poets, sometimes I am proud of us. How a stanza is a woofer pulsing. How wood to us is beautiful, but also an impedance. Your private perceptions, clarity. November like a wrung sponge. Your eye hops over from the dissipated contrail to the crisp one and then tracks southward to the actual plane. Mental recapitulation of the sensuous world, like I had an ice hand that could freeze the tip of every branch. Ice world, white forest, held in some salinity, some meter. Courage, like cool water. We sat on a bank and read from the always only deuterocanonical books we loved. We made a dossier of terrifying descriptions of the sky and bound the sheets together with red thread. We came back to that scene in the Salt Eaters where the Sisters of the Yam are headed to a demonstration, traveling dirt roads in rural Georgia on a rickety old bus. When they look up, all 12 of them, and something in the pivot of a flock of birds makes them realize that the roof of time has been torn off. Tendon, feather, bone, and flesh were riding against a backdrop of 8 minutes ago blue, 50 years ago blue, rode the curvature to the scene. How I pray for access to that feeling. Tony K. Bombara, you are missed. So, look, I know I won't see the end of capital, but you, child, I wonder. Surely it won't be pretty. Yes, no, protected gear, awkward alternative currencies, but maybe also how it might be said of you that you were the ones who saw it through. The destruction from below of all the fucked up supply chains by those giant worms from Dune, the dropping like a fly of every drone. I've seen you by the window with your beautiful wide eyes as storms rolled in. I've tried to teach you the words. I've imagined you remembered at the end of a long life, circled by friends beneath an empty sky. Your friends who wrote the earliest poems of the 22nd century, the poems of storms, of drones, and hoped that when they reached the line about you, it would read, "He who loved lightning, watch them fall." Then came fire. It wasn't yet a new world or the end of the old one, but water, money, feeling overspilled their banks. There was finally something real to be afraid of. There was finally no reason to fear. Even animals approached us as they had in 10,000 years. Buildings were either shelter or they weren't. Music got quiet. Poetry began to ask the question that had hidden the forest. Poetry returned to lists, enumeration, inventory. It chose sides. This was not the same as prophecy. Look around you now. Ask yourself, which of these? The innovators, profit makers, the ones behind high walls, the ones who are planning for the great catastrophes, or the ones with no ability to plan, who live from hour to hour, year to year, in whom terror waits to be uncurdled, who live in the great wide world. Which of these will be the victorious ones? Nobody knows. This last poem is called Last Glimpse. And it is a poem for Saba Mahmood, who passed away last year. She taught here, as many of you know, at UC Berkeley for many years. Last glimpse. Then I gave it up. I gave up thinking that the song of the world, that the song I heard was the song of the world. I gave up lyric, gave up reverie. I gave up aesthesis. I left my notebook on the park bench open with its pages riffling. I kept my head down. I said, okay, fine, Elon Musk is the most important person on the planet. I did not read Ozymandias. But like that monument, I started to crumble. Down, I fell, down into earth, down into its deep, revising heat. And on the other side, my life's antipode. Everything just slightly realigned. A hesitation in the driverless cars, a hint of lemon in the eucalyptus. Also, absence. A shimmer in the air where epic had been. A little grave daffodils around the first person pronoun. Quiet, but not silent. Pitter in the canopy. You look down at your impression in the grass and go, oh, so that's why we sleep on our sides. You no longer need to know the end of the story. You no longer dread the great devaluation, those ziggurats collapsing, those cities on plane. You shake yourself, head high, like a horse, and step out into all the rain that's ever rained. Saba, the light these summer nights thins the line between not here and here. And it lifts the ceiling of the sky. Those higher presences, like traffic cops, they feign indifference, but they feed on life's detail. They need our beating hearts. The redbud, the myrtle, they make a gate. You might get anything, some package from Amazon, some Galadriel come up the walk. At 7 p.m. with life and busyness around you and the spectrum pulsing in the background, you're like, dude, you need to run some language over this shit because it's beautiful. Then you do the dishes. Later, at 3 a.m., your dream life punts the excess back to waking consciousness and you take care of it. Effects, perfumes, the purple flower of the Russian sage, the silvered surface of the stoop, and all the friends who've swirled around it summer nights, here, not here. I merge onto the far right lane to find you. What was your life? It's mine. I have only very awkward ways of writing biographically. There's two eager boys. One's an opera singer, the other one does something he calls energy law. They have the same shoes. Maybe I'm watching the beginning of their life together. Maybe I'm just watching the class reproduce itself. Laughter, gesture, nervous self-extension. You hope it opens on to something. You hope they won't be cruel. Watcher, geometer. Try it on yourself, why don't you? All those years I thought I was a poet, and I was just some person on the metro. But I'm okay with being numerable, number of beats, number of breaths. Each of us pulsing through the nights, each a portion of the sources of plenty. The chanson de geste of your hand across the page, the troubadour amour of your eyes on the horizon, and the voice in my head that speaks to me like I'm a child. Some days I'm like, shut up, superego. Some days I just say, please, always speak to me this way. Relaxing on the shore that won't be here in 50 years. Sea foam on the seawall, swallows tilting at their swallow house. In times of despair, it is customary for the poet to project himself onto some organic life imagined as freer. I have a theory that the further the projection, the worse the situation. Reversing the equation, you get, hey, what's it like to be a slime mold? But life distracts me. Kid things in the yard, the hula hoops and bottles of bubbles, single-use plastic that Allison will track. If I were Rick, I'd use this bit of poem to orient myself. Lumpy couch on screened-in porch, diagonal to the wind, the boys, the birds, the pleasure craft. Northwest, the domes of the Air Force Base. Housing what? My poetry can't do what Rick's or Allison's can, though it's partly for them. Shoes tossed crosswise on the kitchen floor, sleeves of jackets inside out. And the Air Force Base is a Navy base, or it's the Naval Air Systems Command Base. Military websites are very strange. Top News has Gerald Ford announcing the future of carrier aviation. And there's a button at the bottom of the flotation device and a hotline number that says, life is worth living. Back on the porch, I've just finished reading Sea Surface Full of Clouds to Mateo. I said something garbled and academic afterwards, but I think he liked the poem. There's this rocking tandem in it between the shifts in what the color of the water is likened to and the shifting of the color of the water. It has this metaphysics where the substance of the world is light, where light leaves residues that become the things we know and keeps surpassing them. Like capital, I think, because I'm that kind of intellectual. The child in me asks, how does it move? And the older child says, it moves like tilting swallows, like the osprey, like the bill of the heron, still until. The adult keeps his mouth shut. Capital's not predation. Your predator wants to eat you. Capital wants your life. And if you get in its way, it wants you dead. No, more than that. It wants you to think you deserve to die. Red. A wave rolled through, gave us red. The ruby, the cardinal, the furnace, the bellows, the bull. A yellow like the sun at setting, like the wily seed of the grapefruit which I chase around the room. The green ecliptic feel of everything that moves into position. And violet, the moss of it. I'm lying on my back in a flyover state, being flown over, amiably bopping to apocalyptic Mormon pop. It's braggadocio. There's going to be a lot of fronting about the apocalypse between now and the apocalypse. White light, braggadocio. After all those years, a certain kind of man's body passing by still draws me in like a wormhole I can never make it to the other side of. I wince from the too much citrus of it. Sometimes I startle myself, how can you still be so naive? I'm embarrassed that some young part of me really thought if you strain to look like a Marine, maybe all the young Marines will fall for your anti-militarism. I'm dismayed that the default setting for gay white guys still somehow remains petty bourgeois. High value bodies, low value bodies. You fight to keep unseeing that. You say it's only virtual, but the real feeds on the virtual. They put the goggles on you, and you pop into a pre-dawn Sonoran desert. Orange, becoming yellow at the rim, still deep purple toward the zenith. You're placed ambiguously among a group of maybe 13 people. You got a backpack on and they removed your shoes, so it feels a little like an actual border crossing. The bodies are realistic, but the state of the technology still means no one looks you in the eye. You know that thought experiment, what would you do if you were invisible? It comes from Plato. You learn a lot about yourself when you actually are. For a second, I thought I'd wedge myself between the CVP and the child, but the child had a mother. I never stood so close to a cop. We were chest to chest, me against his vest, my eyes on his dead gaze. Then I was inside him. The code allowed me in for 3 or 4 seconds at a time, ribs and intercostals and a thumping heart with no surrounding tissue. It would shove me out, and I'd step back in. Fuck you, I'd mutter, and the interns would tug at my backpack. When the goggles came off, I saw my feet had made a little check mark in the sand, smeared where the tubing connected to its power source. There was a post-experience lounge with a handsome young man serving single-origin coffee. Enfleshed again, Avenger no more, jotting hurried notes for my single-person, paper-thin art. Someday, when we storm the detention facilities, I won't care about that hierarchy, sonnet, cinema, first-person shooter. And in the terror of the walls all coming down, you know what, Saba? We will never be afraid again. Summer nights, dark energy. You have to be quiet to feel it. Somehow at dusk, the little words from other languages become more visible to me. Words on hinges, words on locks. Dear friend, now you know better than I do. I've been calling it death as though it hated me. But that's different from the dark involved with life. How happy our enemies must be to think we deserve to die. And what a horrible year it's been. But death, I reached out my hand tonight and touched it. Did you feel? Fireflies, the fleur-de-lis. All this time, I've been ashamed for thinking what I hunger for is nothing but what they want from me. I didn't know. I didn't know I was so alive. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jess. We're inflashed again. As Jess mentioned, her first book is indeed over there, courtesy of Owen and Noah from Most Books. Please come and consider it. Several of Chris's books are also over there. Come look at them, come talk to the poets, and see you in September for more. Thanks. Thank you, Alex Walter, for your